Hi, it's Ramsey Dewey at the JX Fight Club in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the coach. Our first question today comes from Aaron Gomez, who asks, what is the difference between wrestling and BJJ? Okay. For those of you who are not familiar with the differences between these two grappling styles, they might look very similar from the outside. But the rules and the objectives are quite different. In most forms of wrestling, the objective is to pin your opponent on their shoulders. If you can do that, you win. In Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, the objective is generally to control and submit your opponent. That is, to attack them in such a way as to threaten them with injury or unconsciousness via strangulation. So you can try to break an elbow, break a shoulder, strangle the neck, choke them, and get them to tap out. Tapping means I give up. It's like saying uncle, which is a catch wrestling term, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, in a lot of jiu-jitsu tournaments, well, a lot of times the time expires before the athletes are able to submit each other. So what happens? They keep score. In the IBJJF, the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, the matches are scored as follows. You get 2 points for a takedown, 2 points for a sweep. That's a technique that brings you from a bottom guard position to a top position. You get 2 points for a knee mount position. That's a top position with your knee over the belly or chest of your opponent. And you get 3 points for a guard pass. That's any technique that gets you past your opponent's legs when they are on the bottom and puts you into a top control position. You get 4 points for full mount and 4 points for back mount. Okay. So again, in competition, in the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you can win by either submission or points. And they also have this very confusing thing called an advantage point to make sure that matches can never be tied. There must always be a clear winner in a single elimination tournament. So stylistically, though, you're going to see a lot of differences between grapplers, especially when they transition to other sports like mixed martial arts. Grapplers who have a background in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's a fun word to say fast, Jiu-Jitsu, okay, and grapplers who come from a wrestling background predominantly. Wrestlers are top players. That means they will fight to be on top exclusively, which is awesome in an MMA fight, because when you're on top, you're probably winning that match. Now, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu players, and there are many exceptions to what I'm about to say, generally speaking, tend to be defensive bottom players, meaning a lot of Jiu-Jitsu, a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tends to be guard-centric, meaning they tend to fight from the bottom up. Okay, and again, there are lots of exceptions to that rules. I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well as other grappling arts, and I always fight to be the guy on top. But I understand the bottom game. So you're going to see a lot of stylistic differences. So while a wrestler will never, ever concede to pulling guard, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner will feel quite comfortable going there, most likely. Thanks for the question. Let's see what else we have in the box. Oh man, I almost forgot. I was going to talk about catch wrestling. A lot of you have been asking me, what do I think of catch wrestling, or catch as catch can? And I think it's cool, man. I think it's awesome. Oh, I'm a catch wrestler myself. It's something I practice. It's something I do. So what is catch wrestling? It's a form of wrestling that originated in Lancashire, England. It was originally called Lancashire wrestling and became known as catch, or catch as catch can, meaning grab whatever part of the body you can and break it. So it is a no-holds-barred sport. Holds barred means you can't do a particular hold, you can't do a particular move. Hold is one of the names for a submission technique in catch wrestling. Catch wrestling has a lot of the same techniques as jiu-jitsu, but will often use different terminology. For example, a hold or a stretch. Those are terms for submissions in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. A submission in jiu-jitsu is any time your opponent just taps out and gives up. Right? And that's also the goal of catch wrestling, with the exception that you can also win by pin. And that makes a hugely different dynamic if you watch a catch wrestling tournament versus a jiu-jitsu tournament. In a jiu-jitsu tournament, they will often pull guard and fight from the bottom. And you can't do that in a catch wrestling tournament because if your shoulders are pinned to the floor, it's over and you lose. And so it forces you to become a much more proactive grappler. It's a much more high energy sport because you must consistently fight to get on top. There are no resting points in catch wrestling. So even if you don't train at a catch wrestling gym, I'd recommend if you're a jiu-jitsu practitioner, try training under catch wrestling rules. And it's going to work wonders for your top game. It really will. Again, it's going to force you into these scrambles to put you on top into superior dominant positions every single time. And when you can dictate where the fight goes at will versus thinking, well, I'm good at the guard and my top game kind of sucks and my takedowns suck and my sweeps suck and my transitions suck and my scrambles suck. You know what? Screw that. Practice catch wrestling, be a top player, add those rule sets into the drills that you do, into the roles that you do, and it's going to change your life, friends. So catch wrestling is awesome. You know that term, say uncle? It's an English idiom, like if your older brother picks on you and catches you in a headlock and he's like, say uncle, say uncle. That came from catch wrestling. Because originally in catch wrestling, they wouldn't tap out like they do in jiu-jitsu. They would literally say uncle as the form of submission. Anyway, thanks for the question. Our next question comes from Cameron Warner, and this is kind of a long one, so I'm going to summarize it. In response to a video about Jack Dempsey that I made where I postulated that if Jack Dempsey would have competed in UFC 1 in his prime, he would have won the event because he was a mixed martial artist. The guy was not just a boxer, not just one of the best practical, explosive boxers of all time. He was also a judoka, and he was also an experienced catch wrestler. And one of the reasons I say that he would have won is because UFC 1, UFC 2, UFC 3, UFC 4, they were essentially infomercials for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They were probably the best infomercial for a martial art ever made. So the Gracies hand-picked fighters to make Royce look good, transversely to make Gracie Jiu-Jitsu look good. They picked really big guys with records, with trophies, with belts, with titles, and how can I put this gently? They had no intention of putting Royce in the cage with guys that he wasn't able to beat. Now, Cameron asks, what would have happened if they had put like really, really good, like Olympic level wrestlers in there, for example. Now, I know Dan Severn competed against Royce, and Dan is nothing to shake a stick at. He's a big dude. He's a wrestler, and you know, back then he was pretty good, and he came pretty close to squishing Royce. But what would have happened if you'd taken a guy like, say, Jordan Burroughs or Kyle Sanderson or Alexander Carlin? Put those guys in the cage with Royce. Man, I don't think Royce could have touched those guys. Even without a knowledge of striking or submissions, I think they would have squished him to death. I mean, take a wrestler like Kevin Randleman, who later competed in Pride, and put him against Royce in UFC 1. Yeah, Royce isn't going to win that fight. So let's go back to this question a little bit. I want to read some part of it. He says, could an internationally ranked heavyweight judoka win in that situation, actually knowing many of the submissions Royce was going for? Now that's a good question. Now there were some judoka competing in those early UFCs, but look at Royce's opponent, his very first opponent. Who was it? Art Jimerson. Art One Glove Jimerson, a boxer with zero knowledge of submission fighting. Now, how many grapplers did Hoist actually compete with in those early UFCs? I think 2. Dan Severn in one of those tournaments and Ken Shamrock in another. Ken Shamrock was a professional wrestler, shoot fighter, had some catch wrestling experience, and came as close as anyone did to beating Hoist. And when they had that 30-minute super fight, in my opinion, Shamrock won, even though they called it a tie, because at the end of the fight, Shamrock looked fine and Hoist had a lot of damage. Spent the whole fight on the bottom. By modern MMA judging criteria, Shamrock would have won that fight decisively. But they called it a tie, because again, infomercial for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Now, I don't mean to sound critical of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. I think it's great. I practice Jiu-Jitsu almost every single day. And Jiu-Jitsu's cool. I like it. But where's the lens on this thing? Everybody keeps telling me to look at the lens instead of looking at the screen, because my face is just so beautiful, I gotta look at it. Okay, what was I saying? I forgot. So, could a heavyweight judoka win? You know, you'll notice in those rounds where Hoist fought grapplers, it was never in the first round. Never. His first opponents were the easy pickings, the guys who didn't know how to grapple, whereas the grapplers were on the other end of the tournament, hoping that they could be eliminated along the way or tired out or injured along the way. Because again, they engineered this tournament bracket to allow Hoist the best possible chance at winning while still making it look good and authentic. Because these were real fights. I'm not saying they were fixed or staged or anything like that. They weren't. They simply hand-picked, tough-looking opponents that Hoist could definitely handle. So yeah, there were definitely people walking the earth during the time of UFC 1 that could have squished Hoist and won that tournament, but they either weren't invited or they weren't interested because they weren't paying very much. And nobody knew anything about the UFC back then, so nobody really cared. Thanks for the question. Our next question comes from Infinity Balancer, who says, does one have to attend a martial arts teaching school to learn martial arts? Stupid question, I know, but I would like to get an answer if possible. Okay, Infinity Balancer, my friend. Do you have to go to a martial arts school to learn martial arts? Well, it helps if it's a good martial arts school. But no, not exactly. You do need to train with other human beings to learn martial arts. You really do. Now, there is a limit to what you can learn watching videos or reading books or training by yourself. And those are all things you can and even should do. You should definitely train by yourself. You know, like I always say, do something every day to get stronger, more flexible, and more technical. And those are things that you can and should do by yourself every single day. But eventually, you're going to have to interact with other live humans to find out what happens when you attempt to fight a real live human. Unless your goal as a martial artist is to do forms or do some type of solo drill like Iato, where you pull the sword out of the scabbard and then return it to the scabbard. That doesn't actually require another person. So again, if your goal is to become forms champion of the world, you know, it'll help if you have a coach that understands the forms and can show you how to do them better, but that is totally doable by yourself. But again, if your goal is learn how to fight, learn how to defend yourself, learn how to win a tournament or a combat sport, you've got to have other people there. And martial arts schools, simply put, are the best source of other people to train with who have some idea of what they're actually doing. So, a little bit about my experience. When I started becoming interested in martial arts, there was nowhere to go. I had lived in a very small farming town. There were no martial arts schools anywhere. And even if there were, I didn't have the money to afford one. And so I was in this conundrum. I was being beaten up by bullies at school, and I kept thinking, if only I knew martial arts like Bruce Lee in his movies, I could beat these guys up and stop the bullying. And so I did what I felt was the next best thing. I checked out a bunch of books on martial arts from the library, and I read them and I studied them, and I got my brothers together, and we would practice at home, in the front yard, and go through these moves and stuff. And we learned some things. We definitely didn't become experts, but, it was my start. It was my foot in the door, if you will, into martial arts. And I'm glad I did that. So if that is your option, and again, with the internet and YouTube, there are so many more options to get your foot in the door in martial arts, but ultimately, you're going to have to interact with other people in the martial way. Thanks for the question. Good luck in your training. Our next question comes from our friend Steve, who asks, chin or nose? Which should be the target when focused on the face? What is the strategy? Okay. As a general rule, we're going to use hard weapons like the knuckles against soft targets like the nose or the eyes. But we've got a bunch of good striking places on the face. So what's the strategy? The chin? Here's the deal with the chin. The chin is a lever. It is the lever that allows us to turn the head around, to whip it around. What does that violent action do? Whips the brain around inside the head, boom, 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 rattles it around in that jar of fluid that is the skull, and can cause concussion, which can cause unconsciousness. You can also break the jaw if you hit it hard enough. That's a horrible injury to come back from. So the chin is a great target to attempt to knock your opponent out, especially from the side. So that's the lever. That's the end of the lever, I should say. The nose, what does that do? Well, soft tissue damage. Hit somebody in the nose, you're going to compress it, you're going to shove that cartilage around there, going to make the eyes water, going to make them uncomfortable, possibly bleed. If they're bleeding from the nose, it will become harder to breathe. They might start aspirating blood, at which point a referee should stop the fight if they're aspirating blood, if it's a combat sport. If it's a self-defense situation, somebody's bleeding from the nose and they can't can't breathe through their bleeding nose, well, they'll have a more difficult time fighting you. But you've got other targets too, the eyes. Throw those knuckles at the eyes as well. Where do black eyes come from? Is that a good strategy? Ever been punched in the eye? Not only is it uncomfortable, not only does it do damage, not only does that damage register in the brain, but it also damages the eye itself. And additionally, if I throw my left jab at your left eye, what happens? I have covered up your right eye ever so momentarily, making it a little easier to sneak that right hand in. What else do you have? How about the temples? That's a good striking spot. Because what happens when we land a heavy hook to the temple? Well, there's a fairly thin layer of bone between this part of the head and the brain itself. So generally, we're going to damage our opponent's equilibrium, have them seeing stars, make them dizzy. We can even knock them down with such a strike. How about the ear? Oh, that's a good spot to strike. And it's perfectly legal in all combat sports that allow striking to the head. Strike the ear. Why? That'll mess with the equilibrium. Get a standing fighter to possibly fall down. What's another good spot? This one, right here, right behind this little angle at the jaw. Does a lot of damage. Oh, what else? How about the neck? Punch the neck. If it's a self-defense situation, punch the throat. In most combat sports, it's not allowed to punch directly to the throat, but in a self-defense situation, why not? That'll do damage. That'll incapacitate somebody pretty quickly. So again, there are a lot of great spots to hit on the head. Generally, punching the nose is going to be annoying. It's going to be something that a person with a high tolerance for pain can fight through, and somebody without that high tolerance for pain, it's going to mess them up. But the chin, that can actually knock them out and stop the fight. So there's the logic behind it. This next question, well, it's not really a question. I've got a series of comments lately from new viewers who don't seem to believe that I'm speaking with my real voice. For example, Tawfiq Majid tells me, talk normally. And I've received a number of other comments saying, hey, why don't you use your real voice? Just be yourself. All right, you guys caught me. So I'm gonna use my real voice from now on. I really sound like this, guys, and I guess I'll do the rest of my videos like this from now on. Okay, I can't even keep a straight face doing that. Seriously, what is a 40-year-old man supposed to sound like? Do you hear these sounds coming out of my throat? That's my voice. I don't get it, man. I don't get it. I remember when I was younger, a lot of people would tell me things like this because they couldn't believe that a young man, when I was a teenager, I had a very deep voice. My voice started changing around age 10. So around age 11, I had a really deep voice. And I could sing bass by age 12. And I would often hear people, they'd stare at me like, is that your real voice? You sound like Darth Vader, dude, and you're just a kid. What's going on here? This is blowing my mind. Well, some people have deep voices. My granddad had a very deep voice. I have a deep voice. Who else has a deep voice? James Earl Jones has a deep voice. Some of you probably have deep voices. And that's okay. That's awesome. Talk with your real voice, man. Yeah, that is good advice. Talk with your real voice. Let's talk about that for a minute. Talk with your real voice. What was your name again? Tawfiq Majid. Talk normally. I'm going to rephrase that imperative that you gave me. Because what is normal? Okay, normal is what most people tend to do. And what do most people tend to talk about? Small talk, I suppose. They tend to talk about things that don't really matter very much in the great scheme of things. They tend to talk about things that don't lift them up to a higher level, that don't lift other people up to a higher level. Hey, what's up? How's it going? Good. Even if they're not good. Even if they're not doing well. Talk normally. Let me rephrase that. To use your real voice, which again, people have told me in the comments. Use your real voice. And I'm going to tell you, use your real voice too. Not just this sound that comes out of your throat, but the words that come out of here. That's your real voice. So when somebody says, hey, how you doing? Instead of making small talk, how about this? Say, how are you doing? Because I'm genuinely interested in how you are doing, my friends. That's why I do this Q&A with the coach thing, because I'm genuinely interested in doing what I can to speak with my real voice and hearing your real voice right back, your real words and your genuine concerns. So if you have questions, real questions with your real voice that comes from here, not just from here, leave them down in the comments below or send me an email at ramseydewey@gmail.com. Our next question comes from our friend Tuna Salad, who says, hey Ramsey, I've got a question. I'm a short dude, barely 5'8". What should I consider when fighting bigger opponents? Is there anything special I should train? Any other tips? Huge fan, have a good one. Okay. Now, generally, if giving advice to fight a specific opponent, I would watch that opponent, I would see how they fight, I would see how they perform, I would see how they move, and make an action plan based on that. But generally speaking, to fight bigger, stronger opponents, we must first gain experience fighting bigger, stronger opponents. How do you do that? Spar, roll, train, grapple, whatever your martial art is, against bigger, stronger opponents to see how that plays out. There are a ton of videos out there on the internet, a ton of them, saying something like how to fight a bigger, stronger opponent. A ton of them. I mean, look that up right now. You'll find a bunch. And some of them may even have tips that are useful for you. But I've looked at a bunch of those, trying to figure out, like, what is their strategy here? And a lot of them don't really make sense to me. Or a lot of them don't really pan out in real life when push comes to shove. A lot of people will say, keep your distance from a taller guy, or get on the inside so you don't have to, so you can negate the reach advantage, or something like that. Make angles. And you have to understand the context of what all those things mean and how to do them in the first place. So, and doing it against a bigger, stronger opponent is a whole different skill set than doing it against a smaller opponent. So make angles, bridge the gap, get on the inside, negate the reach, whatever. That's a whole different thing, doing that against, like, stuttering today, man. Got a speech impediment here. No, seriously, I do. I've struggled with stuttering and cluttering throughout my life. And it's difficult. It is difficult. It's something that I have to focus very much to overcome. So I appreciate your patience in watching these videos and bearing with me. So, bridging the gap between a big guy is a totally different thing than bridging the gap with a small guy. Okay. When I started coaching, I opened up my very first gym. It was a great experience. And at one point I had this really big dude come into the gym. The guy was massive. Massive. And I had a really hard time training with the guy because he was so much bigger than me. He was like 3 times my size, 3 times my weight, probably 3 times my strength. And that was tough. I was thinking, man, I don't know if I can teach this guy anything because he's just so big he can squish me any way he wants. And so what I did, I went to YouTube, and this was when YouTube was fairly new, and I looked up all of the fights I could find of big guys fighting small guys to see what worked and what didn't. I didn't watch just the success stories, just the David versus Goliath matches. I watched the guys who got squished, and I was asking myself, why did they get squished? What did they do wrong there? What could they have done better? And then I watched the guys who did well and won those giant slayer matches to try to figure out, why did that work? Did that work because they were fighting a wimpy dude who didn't know what they were doing? Or did that work because they did some technically cool thing? Did it work because they're a super mutant athlete? So there are a lot of variables in those equations. Big dudes don't just come in one size, big, extra big, whatever. They come with different abilities and different skill sets. And I remember sparring with this one dude. He was really tall, and he had a karate background, and he was just really, really good at footwork. And his style was just a little bit confusing, so I could never really get on the inside, and he could always snipe me from the outside, and it was kind of frustrating. And he was also a southpaw, and at the time I wasn't very used to sparring with southpaws. I am now, man, I've trained with so many of them since then. But at the time, this was just a mystery, and this guy seemed untouchable. I can't get to the inside. I can't touch him, can't kick him, can't punch him. He's always countering everything I do. He's always evasive. He's always just this much out of my reach, no matter what. What do I do? Well, if you're asking me this question because you're training with a guy like that, film your sparring sessions and watch them. Watch them like a hawk. Watch the feet. Watch the distance between you. Watch what your training partner is doing, and watch what you're doing. Ask yourself a bunch of questions. What needs to change in order for me to catch up with this guy. Yeah, you really should be filming your training sessions. You really should be filming your sparring sessions and evaluating them. And watch them a bunch of times. And when you watch them, at first your eyes will probably gravitate toward yourself. And that's fine, that's human instinct. We see a mirror and we want to look at it, like, oh, look, there's me in the mirror. Oh, look, there's me in the monitor of this phone while I'm making this video. But watch it again and force yourself to look at the other guy. And then watch it again and force yourself to look at the space in between the fighters. Because all fighting, whether you're fighting a big guy or a small guy or any guy, whether it's stand-up or ground fighting or any style of martial art or combat sport at all, watch the space in between, because all martial arts are about spatial management. Moving around the space, over the space, through the space, in the space, any preposition involving the space. Because when you understand moving through space, you understand how to fight a bigger, stronger opponent. At least a big portion of that. The other portion comes from the experience of actually doing it. Because it's one thing to say, yeah, just understand the space, and another thing when you have a giant on top of you squishing you to death with their weight without even applying any strength yet. So to build up the qualities, to build up the ability to have the intra-abdominal pressure generated from your own abdomen and breathing to withstand the pressure from a giant person trying to squish you or hit you or something like that, that takes practice and that takes experience. And I can't just give that to you. You have to earn that through personal experience. So find some big people and make sure they are big people that you trust, who aren't just going to knock you out flat and break your face, and train with them, drill with them, and learn from them. Experience is invaluable to answer this question. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.